Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, we continue the player review series with a couple of players on the fringes of the Wolves rotation, Josh Okogie and Jordan McLaughlin, plus a couple notes of Timberwolves news. It's all coming up on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. Hopefully you have a weekend of NBA playoff basketball in your future. Thank you, first of all, for making Locked on Wolves your first listen each and every day. Locked on Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, from Apple to Google, Spotify to Odyssey, anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can find Locked on Wolves. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked on T-Wolves. Don't forget the T, and at Beecken with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right, I'm going to hit a couple Timberwolves news notes here. Notes of news. I don't know, something here off the top. Then I want to continue going through the Timberwolves roster, looking at player reviews. Again, started this on Thursday, and just looking at each player on the roster in reverse order of minutes played, and basically discussing what was their season like in the context of what expectations were, and what does it look like moving forward? What are the expectations next year? Also, will they be on the roster? What's the contract situation? Could they possibly be traded? Cover all those things with each player on the roster. If you missed it on Thursday, we talked about the bottom of the roster that included McKinley Wright, a brief a brief conversation on Greg Monroe, Jake Layman, Landor Balmaro, and Nate Knight. Today, we're going to talk about Jordan McLaughlin and Josh Okogie. First, I wanted to hit a couple of brief Timberwolves notes. First of all, the Timberwolves announced, or actually this was reported first by John Krasinski of The Athletic, that Dave Benz, the Timberwolves play-by-play announcer for the last 10 years on Bally Sports North, of course, formerly Fox Sports North, would not be back with the team next year, or back with Bally. The decision was made by Bally to not pick up his option, and was apparently made with the knowledge and approval, I think is the word that John used, of the Timberwolves. Of course, Dave was not a Timberwolves employee, but traveled with the team, and obviously the team has a say in the announcers because of the partnership they have with Bally. But it certainly appears that Jim Peterson will be back as a color analyst. I just wanted to briefly note, I think Dave's great, and it's really too bad. I mean, I think the best thing about Dave is his enthusiasm and the match with Jim Peterson's X's and O's, and obviously the rapport that those two had, and they're obviously great friends. So it is really, really sad that he's not going to be back. And it's an interesting choice by Bally and by the Timberwolves. But Dave's fantastic, and was the perfect balance between just an exuberant, he came across not as what you watch some of these other broadcasting duos and trios across the league, and a lot of times the play-by-play announcer is a complete in the bag homer, and it's tough to watch sometimes. Dave obviously wanted the Timberwolves to win, and he was so excited when the Timberwolves did well. He was excited when they didn't do well. He found a way to be excited when they weren't good, which was often over the past decade, and at the same time was reasonable and straight and to the point when he needed to be. It was really kind of the perfect blend, and obviously he paired well with Jim Peterson. So very sad to see Dave go. I'm sure he's going to land on his feet somewhere great. We'll see what happens next in terms of who the Timberwolves put in the play-by-play spot for Bally Sports North. My other note, completely shifting gears because there's no good way to segue out of that, into the Bleacher Report article that is the toughest offseason decision for every NBA team. I just wanted a quick touch on this because it's a theme that we've already seen throughout the week, and I've talked about both on Monday and Tuesday of this week. Zach Buckley of Bleacher Report published this article that's entitled "The Toughest Offseason Decision for Every NBA Team." And you might be able to guess what he has for the Timberwolves, which I don't know that this would necessarily be my pick for what the toughest decision is, honestly. But he has D'Angelo Russell as the Timberwolves' toughest decision for the offseason. He says the question is whether D'Lo should be part of it. Seems silly to say about a team starting point guard, top distributor, and third scorer, but he might not be as long for Minnesota as you might think. He's approaching the final season of his contract, didn't exactly inspire a ton of confidence down the stretch. He shot below 40% from the field over his last 14 games of the regular season, flatlined in the playoffs at 33.3% shooting, and was benched in the closing minutes of Game 6. And then he cites the Mark Stein report that, quote, numerous rival teams are expecting the Wolves to shop Russell. Um, I, I should also say, and then Buckley says pairing Russell's expiring pact with additional assets could yield a healthy return for Minnesota, but if the idea is getting back value for Russell alone, that might be wishful thinking. So this goes back to my note earlier in the week. I don't think the Timberwolves are going to find plus value in trading D'Lo alone, and I also don't think they're going to be too interested in attaching, say, a couple second rounders this year and a future first with him to trade him. I just don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to sink picks into trading D'Lo when you won 46 games with him, and it just wasn't. Again, I've bear with me if you heard me say this before. This was arguably D'Lo's best season of his career, better than his Brooklyn All-Star season several years ago. He improved defensively. He did exactly what the Wolves asked him to do. He seemed to get along great with Chris Finch. And even if he's not Chris Finch's ideal point guard, and honestly, I don't think he is, this was a disappointing shooting year for D'Lo. In terms of his career, like in almost every other way, it was a better season for him. He was much better defensively. He was a solid distributor. He got to the line more frequently, but it was his worst 3-point shooting season since his third year in the league and his second worst ever by far. He was almost 39% last year, 38.8%. Was over 36% the 2 years prior to that, including his year split between Golden State, Minnesota, and his All-Star year in Brooklyn. This year, he was only 34% from three. He was also only 41.1% from the field, his worst mark since his second year with the Lakers, which was 5 years ago, his second season in the league. So his lowest field goal and three-point percentages in 4 to 5 years. I mean, that's not likely to happen again next year. I think all that to say, I think it's unlikely that Timberwolves bend over backwards to trade D'Lo, but I also don't think they're going to extend him. I think in my mind, this question should really be, will the Timberwolves extend D'Angelo Russell, and or would they consider accepting a trade where they either have to attach value to him to trade him, or they're not getting back requisite value for D'Angelo Russell. I don't think the Wolves are going to trade him or pay somebody to take him off their hands. Again, he was decent. Like, he was good this year. Obviously, you want more out of a max contract guy, but it doesn't mean you sink additional assets to try and move off of a max contract guy who wasn't bad. It's not like he was. I used this example the other day. He wasn't like Chandler Parsons at the end of his career. He's not somebody you're just going to bury on your bench. He was a good player this year, better than serviceable. So I think that the narrative's already spiraled a little, and I know that I talked about it Monday and Tuesday, but only because I think it's interesting. It's a really interesting thing here because the Wolves could end up trading him. I just don't think it's the most likely scenario. So we'll obviously continue to keep an eye on that. Next, I want to talk about Josh Okogie, or actually, I think Jordan McLaughlin. Yeah, we'll talk about Jordan McLaughlin next, and then let's talk about Josh Okogie, and then we'll talk about Jordan McLaughlin to close the show and review each of their individual seasons in terms of context, etc. First, though, let's talk about our friends over at Built Bar. Summer is coming. It's almost here. With summer, you're going to need some food on the go. Built Bars are the perfect snack to take with you on family vacations. Throw them in your bags and your kids' backpacks. Make sure that everyone has a bar so you're fueled for your summer adventures. The best part about Built Bars is that they're healthy and delicious. No more sacrificing delicious food for health. With Built Bar, you can have both. It's easy, and all you have to do is go to Built.com and order now. If you haven't tried Built Puffs, you need to. They're fantastic. It tastes just like a treat, a delicious marshmallowy treat. If that's not enough flavor, you can just try the Mix Box. The Mix Box comes with 12 flavors of bars and puffs. Built Bar makes sure that there's something for everyone. Most Built Bars have just 130 calories, only 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to your average candy bar, which typically has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. Go to Built.com to get all your favorites: banana cream pie, raspberry, double chocolate, and so many more. They're all delicious, and new flavors are coming out all the time. Check them out at Built.com. Again, Built.com with the promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Thanks again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Make sure to go check out the Locked On NBA Big Board show. Host Rafael Barlow from NBA Draft Junkies and the author of the NBA Big Board newsletter is joined by Richard Stamen, Sam Ferris, and Leif Thulin, giving fans an in-depth look into the NBA draft, mock drafts, player rankings, and of course, big boards. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Now is the perfect time to subscribe and listen to that show as we will begin to gear up for draft season here very shortly. All right. Let's talk about Josh Okogie. Keep mixing these up. So what I'm doing, if you missed Thursday's show, is I'm going through and I'm reviewing each player on the roster in reverse order of minutes played this year, reviewing their season in the context of what the expectations were, what they did last year, et cetera, and then also what they're going to do moving forward. Will they be on the roster, et cetera? Josh Okogie is a really interesting one. He, of course, was drafted by Tom Thibodeau. Other than Karl-Anthony Towns, the only player remaining from the Tom Thibodeau era. So spanning the Tibbs and Gerson Rosas eras, those are the only two players to do that. He was started more games than not as a rookie under Tibbs, and then under Ryan Saunders was a part-time starter each of the last couple of years. His career high in minutes played was under Saunders in the 1920 season, 25 minutes per game. And remember, late in his rookie season was when he had the block on James Harden. He became kind of this national story of, the national TV block that he had on Harden. So he was on NBA TV to talk about his defense. He was considered one of the better perimeter defenders. He had a good run with Nigeria this last offseason in the World Cup. And I think Eurobasket Africa as well. But a couple of different international showings where he played pretty well. The shooting was never there, of course. The profile was always as a plus defender, and the hope was he could develop something of a jump shot. Saunders tried sticking him in the corner and letting him shoot corner threes because early in his career, he was actually a pretty good corner three-point shooter. He shot, I say pretty good, relatively speaking. His second season, so that was the year that was shortened on the back end by the pandemic, 1920, he shot just a hair under 35% from the corners. So last year, the thought was, hey, let him play in the corners. If he can shoot 35%, he can at least hold defenses honest. He'll knock down at least one of every three shots he takes from the corners. And then he plummeted to 27.9% from the corners, even though 40% of his three-point attempts came from the corners, because that was what the Wolves tried to do with him defensively, or offensively, I should say. And he played a lot more three last year for the Timberwolves as the Wolves had Anthony Edwards at the 2. And then after Chris Finch took over, he realized that, hey, this doesn't make sense to let Josh Okogie launch, 2-3 threes from the corner and make 0 or 1 of them each game. And he began using him offensively, similar to how they used Jared Vanderbilt. Let him play like a power forward, play at the elbows and horn sets, play in the dunker spot more frequently. And that's what he did this year in the rotation. The Wolves essentially tried to hide him offensively, which was the right move. It's easy to forget Josh Okogie was actually in the starting lineup at the beginning of the season. He started the Timberwolves' first 3 games and 4 of the first 7 games. But remember, he started the first 3, saw his minutes go from 21 to 18 to 11, and then he did not play at all in the Milwaukee Bucks game, which was a win. That was Jared Vanderbilt's first start. Finch started Vando at Milwaukee, coming off a disappointing home loss to New Orleans, in which the Wolves barely scored. They scored like 90-ish points in that game. And Vando guarded Giannis in that game. And then all of a sudden the next game, Okogie wasn't starting, but was back in the rotation, played 19 minutes. And then that was the most minutes he played in a game until he started a game right after Thanksgiving, when I believe, I forget what the issue was. There's an injury issue or something. I don't think it was quite the COVID problems, but it was that Pacers game. And he started and played 33 minutes. That was the only other game he played more than 20 minutes in until the beginning of January. So it was basically once a month where Okogie was finding his way into like heavy rotation minutes. But he didn't start any games. The only game he started after Thanksgiving was that win over Boston when the team was decimated by COVID, and they had only 8 guys that played in the game, 7 guys that played normal minutes. Okogie started and played 15 minutes in that game and didn't start a game the rest of the season. He was out of the rotation for long stretches. There was a stretch in which he played in only 1 of 15 games back from the end of January through the beginning of March. And then he was kind of on the fringes of the rotation down the stretch, partly due to some rest to Patrick Beverley, partly due to some of Anthony Edwards' injury issues, and then also just kind of as a situational defensive sub. All things considered, this was obviously a disappointing season for Josh. Now, him being on the fringe of the rotation and only playing in 49 games has as much to do with the Timberwolves' improved depth as it does with Josh not playing well. Yes, this was his worst season, but it was also his worst season in regard to how often he was asked to play and what he was asked to do, because the Wolves had a Taurean Prince. They had Patrick Beverley. They had guys that could replicate some of the things he could do, but also make threes. And Jared Vanderbilt is essentially the power forward version of Josh Okogie. He's what, 5 inches taller, similar wingspan in terms of his position. So he does the rebound, the energy, the transition stuff that Josh Okogie does, but he can play the 4 and play the small ball 5, whereas Josh Okogie was always miscast when Ryan Saunders, remember, he tried to play him at the small ball 4, but the problem was, as I referenced earlier, Saunders tried to stick him in the corners and let him shoot threes. That didn't work. Okogie can play the small ball 4 in a pinch if you're not asking him to shoot threes, but Finch obviously just did away with that idea and said, hey, I'd rather have Vando at the 4. Remember, Vanderbilt didn't see regular rotation minutes until Chris Finch came over. He did for a brief stretch under Saunders, but it was never really consistent. And so Josh really didn't play simply because the Timberwolves they had a few guys that were better than him. It was a deeper team than normal. And the Timberwolves considered trading him at the trade deadline. There were teams rumored to be interested, the Utah Jazz being one of them. The one that was most frequently messaged looking for perimeter defense help. Of course, they made deals elsewhere, but the Timberwolves weren't going to just give away Josh Okogie. I'm sure that they were looking for a first-round pick for him and not a second. They already have 3 seconds this year. And the Wolves making a playoff run themselves wanted to keep some depth because, again, Okogie's a guy who can play serviceable minutes at the NBA level because he's that good defensively. He is going to find a home next year, but he's an unrestricted free agent this offseason, and the Timberwolves it's very unlikely that they'll be bringing Josh Okogie back unless for some reason he doesn't find a home elsewhere and he's willing to come back to Minnesota for something like a vet minimum type deal. But I'd be willing to bet he gets something that's a little bit more than that this year. I'm sorry. I said he was unrestricted. He's actually a restricted free agent because he's coming off his rookie contract. I would be surprised if the Timberwolves, they'll probably initially issue a qualifying offer, but then withdraw if anybody's interested. But in general, I'd be surprised if anybody tried to sign him as a restricted free agent and he ends up, I would think, signing for something less later. But there's still some upside. I mean, he was a little bit, he's a little bit of not quite as old as people might assume. It feels like he's been around forever, but he's only 4 years in. He's just coming off his rookie contract. He doesn't turn 24 until the beginning of September. So there will be somebody that's interested in adding Josh Okogie to their team because, again, serviceable rotation minutes plus defense, that's all there. If you can find a way to hide him offensively, and if he understands his role realistically is probably going to be an 8 to 10 minute energy defense type role, there can be a spot for him. I just think it's really unlikely it's with the Timberwolves when you have guys that could replicate already some of the things he can do. And also, I didn't mention Leandro Bolmaro earlier. I just mentioned Prince, Beverly, some of the new veteran additions to the team. You have to consider the emergence of Jalen Noel, who's still under contract for less than what Okogie would make on the open market. Jalen Noel is far better offensively and obviously far worse defensively, but you've got the offensive version of Okogie in a somewhat limited one-dimensional player, not one-dimensional, a non-two-way player, right? Josh is all defense, Jalen Noel's all offense. So you've already got the offensive version of Okogie, and Leandro Bolmaro should be able to replicate the defense with eventually better offense than Okogie because of his ability to handle and pass the ball, his length, some of those things that he should be able to bring to the table. So I think it's highly unlikely that Josh Okogie's back. It's disappointing on some level because, Okogie was so fantastic in terms of being part of the community. Obviously, everything he did in the wake of the George Floyd tragedy back in 2020. And by all accounts, a fantastic teammate and a great person around the organization. So we'll see. Who knows? I could be completely off base. I just think it's unlikely that Josh is back next season. And he was more of a casualty of the Timberwolves' improved depth than anything else. Okay, let's close the show today by talking about Jordan McLaughlin, who is a really interesting one to discuss. And I think we'll spend some more time later this offseason talking about Jordan McLaughlin because there's a lot to say about him in regard to what the Timberwolves strategy is going to be next year in the backcourt, etc. But first, though, let's talk about our friends over at betonline.net. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NBA playoffs, the MLB, and this weekend's Run to the Roses as the Kentucky Derby is back. Also, of course, NBA odds with the playoffs. Golden State is 7-point favorites as the series moves back to Golden State. which is fascinating, given that the series is tied 1-1, and this game, of course, is Friday night. It's at Golden State. Memphis is obviously the higher seed. Memphis is 7-point underdogs. Of course, no Dylan Brooks after being suspended for the hard foul on Gary Payton II. And then also other lines for basketball Friday, or excuse me, that game is Saturday, not Friday. Man, that's Saturday's game. So I guess I'll give you the other Friday lines. Right now, a pick 'em for Suns Mavs, which is also fascinating. I don't know if that line just isn't posted for some reason. And then the Heat are 3-point underdogs at Philadelphia on Friday night as well. So be sure to check out betonline.net for all your NBA playoff odds. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sport wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, let's close today's show by talking about Jordan McLaughlin. A really interesting player to talk about, and here's why. The way the season ended, you would think that Jordan McLaughlin was a vital member, a key cog in the Timberwolves rotation. And then you look at his per game stats and you realize that he actually played in more games this year than either of the previous 2 years. Now, a lot of that's because he was a two-way player the last 2 years, but all the per game numbers are down. The shooting percentages, or at least his 3-point shooting percentage, is down. Um, a lot of his rate-based stats are down. His rebound rate is down. His assist rate is down. Um, and some of the defensive metrics don't like what he did this year either. But if you only watch the playoffs, for instance, I have a buddy that I work with who isn't a Timberwolves fan, but he's a big NBA fan. And he made a comment to me the other day. He had been watching the Wolves Grizzlies series, and he was like, I said something about how Jordan McLaughlin was, had some similarities to Tyus Jones in the way that they play, what they provide to their teams. And he goes, McLaughlin's better than Tyus Jones, right? And I was like, no, he's not. But I mean, like, he can replicate some of what he does at a fraction of the price, et cetera. And yes, there are similarities, as was my point initially. But just as a casual fan watching a couple games in this series, not I should say casual fan, a non-Timberwolves fan, a general NBA fan, the optics were, hey, Jordan McLaughlin's every bit as good or better than Tyus Jones because he played that well in that, what was it, the game 4 win. The game 4 win after not playing at all in game 3. But wasn't necessarily the story of the season for Jordan McLaughlin. Remember, early in the year, he was in the rotation, which is easy to forget, but he had a couple of really bad games and then he fell out of the rotation. He was in the rotation for the first, 8 games of the season, but he shot 1 of 7 in that big blowout loss to the Clippers. Then he didn't play in 3 of the next 4 games. Then he was back in the rotation. Then he didn't play in 6 of 8 games, and overall 7 of 10 games he missed. Not miss, he just didn't play due to Chris Finch's decision to not play him. And then he played 10 or more minutes or didn't play in like 10 straight games, going back to January. So obviously he played quite a bit during the COVID issues. Late December, was completely out of the rotation again in January. But then when Finch played him 17 minutes in the loss to Phoenix on January 28th, from that point forward, he played in all regular season games except for 2 and played double-digit minutes in every single game from that point forward. He was a regular cog in the rotation, played very well. Now, he only had 4 of those games. We're talking like 32 games. He only had 4 in double figures scoring because even though he was playing double figures minutes, he largely was D'Angelo Russell's backup. Patrick Beverley didn't really play backup point guard as much. He obviously ran the point at times, but because he was a starter, he played with D'Lo, and then McLaughlin would play the non-D'Lo minutes a lot of times alongside Patrick Beverley, who was essentially playing the 2. So the role wasn't quite as consistent for McLaughlin. Again, even though he played in more games, the minutes per game, and then also all the other per game stuff, because that goes along with it, of course, the points, the rebounds, the assists, the steals, all that stuff per game was down. The rate-based stuff that was up, the steal rate was up, the block rate was way up, the turnover rate was down, which was great to see, as was the usage rate. And he kind of found his role as just a distributor, somebody he had that insane assisted turnover stretch, which is very Tyus Jones-esque. From the start of January to the start of March, it got up to like 58 to 1. He had 58 assists to 1 turnover over that stretch, something insane. And was still very good in terms of not turning the ball over down the stretch this season. Going back and looking at this, and in fact, I could just pull this very quickly. From January 9th to Yeah, January 9th to February 16th, he turned the ball over one time, which is insane. And then the actual ratio is something like 50 something to 5 over the course of 2 months, assists to turnover. So that stretch was very Tyus Jones-esque, and he is a better spot up shooter, catch and shoot shooter from deep than Jones was early in his career. He's more comfortable shooting from deep. Tyus Jones never looked like he was comfortable shooting threes in a Timberwolves uniform. He's obviously much better now from there. I should note McLaughlin, as I said earlier, McLaughlin's 3-point shooting percentage was down to 31.8% this year. But prior to the season, over his first 2 seasons in the league, Jordan McLaughlin shot 36.9% from three. So coming into the season, the Timberwolves thought they were signing a plus, an above average 3-point shooter. So I think this year is ultimately the outlier because he did shoot well from three down the stretch. He, of course, had that 4-for-4 game in the playoffs from 3-point range. So what is Jordan McLaughlin moving forward? Well, Chris Finch obviously acknowledged late in the season that he was a vital member of the rotation and played him in 29 of the final 32 games of the regular season. And then he did get the DNP-CD in game 3 of the playoffs, and the Timberwolves lost. Remember, McLaughlin played in the blowout loss in game 2, didn't get on the floor in game 3. Finch said sometimes you do stupid things. He played 14 or more minutes over the final 3 games, was good in the final game as well. 9 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, and 0 turnovers in the loss to Memphis in game 6. I think the Timberwolves go into next year with the backcourt looking the same. I think the Timberwolves have Russell and Beverly as starters. I think McLaughlin's the primary backup, and maybe they start to give him some of Beverly's minutes. I don't know that makes a ton of sense, but unless the Wolves think that McLaughlin makes more sense moving forward and play Russell off the ball even more. Beverly, of course, is an expiring deal after next season. And McLaughlin signed that deal in restricted free agency last offseason, where he's with the team for just $2.1 million this year. And then the team has an option on his deal for the following season. So he could be around at just $2.3 million getting into 23 and 24. Or I'm sorry, it's not an option. It's just a partially guaranteed number. So he likely will be back in 23, 24. So the Wolves may start to give him a few more minutes if they decide he is worthy of the regular rotation. Again, I think remember he's a little bit older, even though he's only in his 3rd season. He just turned 26 at the beginning of April, about a month ago. So there's not a ton of upside there. And he's obviously a little bit on the smaller side. The defense, I think, was very good. Some of the ESPN, like the ESPN real plus minus numbers, which I generally really like, were harsh on him. I think that his ceiling, frankly, is like a 10 to 12, maybe a 16-minute a game guy, can spot start in a pinch. I just think if you overextend Jordan McLaughlin, his offensive limitations are a little bit too great. However, he is the perfect guard to back up a higher usage guy like a D'Angelo Russell, or potentially whoever the Timberwolves get if they were to trade D'Angelo Russell. McLaughlin is a good backup point guard. I don't think he can carry the load to the extent of, say, a Tyus Jones, who's arguably the league's best backup point guard. The line for Jordan McLaughlin, it's really tough to find it, but I do think that there's some diminishing returns if he gets overextended. That said, at $2.3 million, he's an absolute bargain, a complete steal, and a very good backup point guard. If he can bring his 3-point shooting back consistently to the 36 to 38% range, that's going to make all the difference in the world for the Timberwolves moving forward. So hopefully that's able to happen. I would 100% expect him to be on the roster next year, to be in the rotation from day one, which again, he was this year. Remember, he still played in 62 of the Timberwolves' 82 regular season games and 5 of their 6 playoff games. But I don't think Chris Finch will be as quick to pull the plug on J-Mac in the rotation. I don't think we'll have stretches where he doesn't play in 7 of 10 games like we did in the middle of this season. I think he'll be a rotation cog for the next year, probably 2, and continue to be D'Lo's backup. And the Timberwolves are good with Jordan McLaughlin's on the floor. I don't think there's any 2 ways about it. Okay. That's all we have for you today. We'll, of course, be back next week, Monday through Friday. We'll continue the player review series. We'll begin to start to shift our focus to the draft, likely the week after next. As we get deeper into the roster, into the top 9 players in the rotation, we are going to spend a little bit more time on each player instead of just one segment moving forward, and going to get some other opinions on some of the Timberwolves' better players, or the players that played the heaviest minutes this year. Have a couple guests on the show to talk D'Lo, to talk Karl-Anthony Towns, and some of those other players as well. So that's all upcoming next week. Thanks again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube. You can also find this show anywhere you listen to podcasts: Apple, Google, Spotify, Odyssey. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. Of course, Locked On Wolves is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. A reminder, you can make your second listen Locked On NBA, from the first jump ball of the play-in tournament several weeks ago to the last possession of the finals, which is only about, 5-6 weeks away. Locked On experts take you deep inside the playoffs with insight and analysis affecting all 30 teams. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.